What happens when a ruthless racist gang, fueled by hatred, underestimates a black veteran they see as just another helpless target, only to see his tattoo and freeze in fear? Watch as a seasoned soldier, a man who's seen the darkest sides of humanity, takes on his toughest challenge yet, facing his old Special Forces team member who went rogue and created a merciless gang that preys on anyone they deem inferior. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The late morning sun filtered through the cafe's large windows, casting soft patterns of light across the polished wooden tables. The place was quiet, save for the low hum of conversations and the occasional clink of a ceramic mug being set down. David Carter, seated at his usual corner booth, glanced out the window as he sipped his coffee. The steam rose slowly, curling like smoke against the light. At 68, David had carved out a routine that suited him. The cafe was a sanctuary of sorts, a place to sit, think, and enjoy the rhythms of ordinary life. He stretched his legs beneath the table, the stiffness in his knees reminding him of the years spent in service. Despite the aches, he was still solidly built, his posture commanding respect without effort. "Refill, Mr. Carter?" Grace's warm voice cut through his thoughts. He smiled up at her. "Why not? Keeps me young." Grace chuckled as she topped off his mug, her auburn curls bouncing. "Not many people could keep up with you, young or old." She lowered her voice. "Have you noticed those guys outside?" David glanced through the window. 4 men loitered near the cafe's entrance, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. They leaned against the brick wall, their body language sharp and territorial. David took another sip, his expression unreadable. "They've been hanging around more lately," Grace added, her voice tight. "I've heard things about them." "Don't worry about me," David replied evenly, his eyes not leaving the men. The bell above the door jingled as the group entered, their boots thudding against the floor, conversations hushed. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a confident sneer, scanned the room. He locked eyes with David, his grin widening as if drawn to a challenge. "Well, well," the man drawled, sauntering toward David's booth. "Looks like the old guard's still kicking." David met his gaze without flinching. He didn't respond, letting the moment stretch. The silence between them was taut, the air charged with something unsaid but deeply understood. The man's smirk faltered for the briefest second, but he recovered quickly. "Mind if we join you?" he asked, the question clearly rhetorical. David leaned back slightly, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "That depends. Can you handle sitting quietly?" The burly man grinned as he slid into the booth across from David without waiting for an invitation. His cronies loitered by the counter, their stares hard and mocking as they surveyed the room. The hum of conversations faded into uneasy silence, leaving only the faint clatter of a spoon against a mug. "You don't get it, old man," Mike began, leaning forward with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "There's places for people like you, and this ain't one of them." David met his gaze, calm and steady. "Didn't know there were rules for sitting in a cafe." Paul, the wiry one with a patchy beard, barked a laugh. "Oh, there's rules. First one, know your place. Second one, don't think you're welcome when you're not." He glanced at David's weathered hands and added, "You really think anyone here gives a damn about some old black veteran?" The others snickered, their laughter sharp and hollow. Grace, standing behind the counter, slammed her hands on the counter. "Enough! You don't talk to him like that in my cafe." Mike turned toward her, his smirk deepening. "Your cafe," he repeated mockingly. "This whole town's ours, Grace. You think anyone here's gonna stand up for you?" "For him?" He gestured toward David with a flick of his hand. "I do," Grace said, though her voice wavered. "Now leave." Mike ignored her, leaning closer to David. "Tell me, old-timer, what's it like? Spending your life thinking you fought for something real? Thinking you mattered? You don't. Never did. Not here. Not anywhere." David's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. Paul stepped closer, crossing his arms. "Yeah. What did you even fight for? A country that barely tolerates you? Bet you spent more time cleaning boots than firing a weapon. They don't want you, old man. Hell, Nobody does. The words stung the air, heavy with venom. A few patrons shifted uneasily in their seats, but no one said a word. Must feel good, Mike continued, his voice dripping with mockery. Sitting here, pretending you belong. Pretending anyone's gonna stand up for you when it really counts. But you don't. Black. White, it doesn't matter. You're just another nobody trying to relive his glory days in a town that doesn't care. David finally set his coffee cup down. The clink of ceramic against wood unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Funny, you seem to care an awful lot about me sitting here. Mike's grin faltered, but he recovered quickly. Care? Nah, we just don't like seeing people like you getting comfortable where you're not wanted. Paul chimed in, sneering. Yeah, you think you're tough? Bet you didn't even see real combat. Bet you were just another token they threw into the ranks to make themselves feel good. David's voice was low, steady. You talk a lot for someone who's never earned the right to be in those ranks. The comment struck a nerve, and Paul lunged forward. But Mike stopped him with a hand on his chest. Easy, Paul, he said, though his own smile had turned into a thin line of irritation. He turned back to David. Let me make this real simple for you, old man. People like you don't last long in places like this, so why don't you save yourself some trouble and move on before things get messy? David leaned back slightly, his calm gaze unwavering. Messy? Like the mess you make every time you open your mouth? The cafe was deathly silent. Mike's face darkened, his smirk replaced by something uglier. You got a smart mouth for someone who's got nothing left. But don't worry, we'll fix that. He stood abruptly, towering over David. Come on, boys. Let's leave the war hero to his coffee. We've got more important things to do. The gang moved toward the door, but as they reached it, Mike turned back, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. But hey, if you're feeling brave, maybe come see us outside, old man. Let's see if you've still got any fight left in you. Paul laughed, adding, Yeah, show us what a big, tough soldier you are. Bet you won't even make it down the block without needing a nap. Mike smirked one last time and spat on the floor near David's booth. That's for all the worthless soldiers who thought they were good enough. Spoiler alert, you're not. The bell above the door jingled as they left, their mocking laughter lingering in the air. Grace let out a shaky breath, her voice trembling with anger. David, I'm so sorry. I didn't think they'd... David raised a hand, silencing her. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes fixed on the door. It's not your fault, Grace, he said quietly, brushing the wrinkles from his sleeve. She frowned, concern etched on her face. David, what are you doing? He didn't answer, his hand grazing the edge of his forearm before he walked toward the door. I'll be right back, he said, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. The midday sun bore down on the street as David stepped out of the cafe. Across the road, the gang loitered in an alleyway, their laughter harsh and grating. David adjusted his jacket, his steady strides carrying him toward them, his expression unreadable. Mike noticed him first and let out a mocking laugh. Well, looks like the old man found his courage. What's the matter, Grandpa? Couldn't handle us having the last word? David stopped a few feet away, his gaze sharp. You left before you finished your story. Thought I'd come out here and get the full version. Paul snorted. What story? We already told you everything you need to know. Guys like you don't belong here. That's all there is to it. Mike stepped closer, his grin widening. Yeah, but since you're so curious, I'll spell it out for you. We're cleaning up this town, getting rid of the filth that's been dragging it down for years. That means your kind. David's voice was low and steady. And what kind is that? Paul sneered, leaning against the brick wall. Don't play dumb. You know exactly what we mean. Black, old, useless. Take your pick. You're the problem. Mike chuckled, shaking his head. You walk around like you're somebody, like you've earned respect. But you're just another washed-up vet trying to relive his glory days. Newsflash, old man. Nobody cares what you did. Not here. Not anywhere. David's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Letting their words hang in the air, Paul pushed off the wall, stepping closer. You think anyone's going to stand up for you? Nobody wants you here, and if you're too stupid to figure that out, maybe we ought to teach you." Mike smirked. "Yeah, you look like you could use a reminder about who runs this town." David finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp. "You think running your mouth makes you powerful? All I see are a bunch of cowards hiding behind hate." The comment struck a nerve. Mike's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Cowards!" he spat. "You don't know a damn thing about us." "Then explain it to me," David said, his tone unyielding. Mike stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "We're building something real. Strength, loyalty, brotherhood. Everything this country used to stand for before it got overrun by people like you." Paul laughed. "Yeah, we don't need your kind messing it up again. You're done, old man." David's calm demeanor cracked, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think strength is tearing others down? That loyalty is hate? You have no idea what real strength looks like." Paul lunged first, swinging wildly at David's chest. David sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Paul's wrist and twisting it until the wiry man cried out in pain. He shoved him back, sending him stumbling into the alley wall. Mike charged next, his fist aimed at David's jaw. David ducked and countered with a precise strike to Mike's ribs, making him stagger. A third man hesitated, but then joined the fray, aiming a kick at David's side. David blocked it, twisting the attacker's leg and forcing him to the ground. The fight was brief, but brutal. David moved with the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades mastering his body, his age doing nothing to dull his reflexes. One by one, the gang members faltered, their confidence replaced by frustration and pain. Mike managed to grab David's arm during a scuffle, slamming him against the brick wall. "Big talk for someone who's about to—" His words stopped abruptly, as his eyes fell on David's forearm, where his sleeve had ridden up during the fight. "What? What the hell is that?" Mike stammered, his voice shaking. David frowned, following Mike's gaze. His tattoo, once a symbol of camaraderie and pride, was now the center of the gang leader's attention. Paul froze mid-motion, his expression shifting from anger to shock. "No way," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible." The third man, still clutching his side, scrambled to his feet, his face pale. It's the same as his," he stuttered, backing away. David adjusted his sleeve, narrowing his eyes. "You know this tattoo?" Mike's bravado had evaporated entirely, replaced by something David couldn't quite place. Fear and recognition. He stepped back, shaking his head. We've seen it before," he muttered. Paul grabbed Mike's arm. "We gotta go. Now." David's voice stopped them cold. "You're not going anywhere. Not until you tell me what you know." Mike hesitated, then blurted out, "It's Jack's. He has the same one." David's eyes widened slightly, the name hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Jack?" Paul nodded quickly, his fear palpable. "Yeah, Jack Evans. He's the one who—" "Shut up!" Mike snapped, but it was too late. David's expression hardened, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "I'm going to find Jack," David said coldly. "And when I do, you'll wish you'd stayed out of my way." The gang exchanged terrified glances, their earlier bravado shattered. Without another word, they turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. David rolled his sleeve back down, his mind racing. Jack Evans, a name from his past, a man he'd once called a comrade. And now, a man who was clearly at the heart of something far darker than David had imagined. As he turned back toward the cafe, his resolve hardened. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cafe was quieter than usual when David stepped back inside, the door's bell ringing softly above him. Grace stood behind the counter, her face tight with worry. The handful of remaining patrons glanced at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease, before quickly returning to their drinks. David walked to his corner booth and sat down heavily, his thoughts a storm of questions and memories. Grace hesitated for a moment before walking over, holding a fresh pot of coffee. She set it down on the table and slid into the seat across from him. "What happened out there?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. David didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands, his sleeve now pulled back into place, hiding the tattoo that had rattled the gang. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but edged with tension. They recognized something they shouldn't have. Grace frowned, confused. Recognized what? David hesitated, then unbuttoned his cuff and rolled his sleeve up just enough to expose the intricate tattoo. Grace leaned closer, her brow furrowing. What is it? It's a mark, David said, his voice heavy with meaning. A mark of the unit I served with. Elite forces. We called ourselves the Ghosts. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Not many people know about us, and the ones who do, they don't forget. Grace stared at the tattoo, then at David, her concern deepening. And they knew what it was? David nodded. They knew. They recognized it immediately. And they mentioned a name. Jack Evans. He leaned back, crossing his arms as his eyes narrowed in thought. He was part of my unit. We served together, but we never saw eye to eye. Jack always had ideas, twisted ideas about loyalty, strength, and what it meant to be part of something bigger. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. Do you think he's connected to them, to that gang? David's jaw tightened. It's not a coincidence. Jack's the type who'd twist what we stood for into something ugly. If he's leading them, it means he's taken the values we bled for and turned them into a weapon for hate. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. What do you think they're planning? Why are they here? David shook his head. I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it's bigger than some punks harassing people in a cafe. They talked about cleaning up the town and taking it back. His voice grew colder. It's hate, plain and simple, and Jack's behind it. Grace glanced at the other patrons, lowering her voice further. You're not thinking of getting involved, are you? David, these people are dangerous. David met her gaze, his eyes steely. I've faced dangerous people before, and I'm not about to let them poison this town with their hate, especially not if Jack's involved. Grace leaned forward, her voice urgent. You're not in the field anymore, David. You're one man. What if they come after you, or after the cafe? David's lips pressed into a thin line. If they come after me, they'll regret it. And if they think they can bully this town into submission, they've got another thing coming. He paused, then added, I need to know more about them. Where they operate, what they're planning. Can you think of anyone who might have seen or heard something? Grace thought for a moment before nodding. There's a guy who works nights at the gas station on Main. He's always talking about the trouble they cause. Says he sees them hanging around a warehouse by the old train tracks. Maybe he knows something. David nodded. That's a start. If they've got a base of operations, that's where I'll begin. Grace reached out, her hand briefly touching his arm. Just be careful, David. I've seen the way they look at people who stand up to them. They don't just want to hurt you. They want to make an example out of you. David's expression softened slightly. I've been an example before, Grace. This won't be the first time. He rolled his sleeve back down and buttoned it. But, thank you. Grace hesitated, then stood up, pouring another cup of coffee for him before walking back behind the counter. David watched her go, his mind already turning over what he'd learned. Jack Evans. After all these years, it made sense now, the fear he'd seen in their eyes when they recognized the tattoo. Jack had always been a leader, but not in the way that inspired trust or camaraderie. He ruled with intimidation, twisting the strong into instruments of his will. David clenched his fist, his knuckles whitening as memories of his time in the unit resurfaced. Jack had always been ambitious, always pushing boundaries. But this, to take what they'd fought for and twist it into hate and terror, it wasn't just an insult, it was a betrayal. He drained the last of his coffee and stood, slipping a few bills onto the table. As he walked toward the door, Grace called out, "Let me know if you need anything." David turned back, giving her a small nod. "I will." Stepping into the sunlight, he glanced down the road, his eyes narrowing. The gang thought they could scare him into submission. Jack thought he could turn their shared past into something vile. They were wrong. David Carter was no stranger to danger, and this fight, it was only just beginning. The sun dipped low in the sky as David approached the edge of town, his boots crunching softly on the gravel road. The air smelled faintly of rust and oil, a lingering reminder of the trains that had once passed through the now abandoned tracks. Ahead, the outline of the warehouse came into view, a hulking structure of corrugated metal and shattered windows, its edges softened by overgrown weeds. David slowed his pace, scanning the area. A single street lamp buzzed to life, casting a dim pool of light over the warehouse entrance. Parked nearby were two vehicles, a battered pickup truck and an older model sedan, their presence confirming that the gang was inside. Keeping to the shadows, David moved closer, his steps deliberate and silent. The perimeter was poorly guarded, a testament to their arrogance. From his vantage point near a pile of discarded crates, he could hear muffled voices filtering out from the building. "Tonight's the night," one of them said, his tone excited. "Jack said it's time to send a message. Show everyone we're not messing around." David's jaw tightened. He crouched lower, edging toward a partially open window. Peering inside, he spotted three men gathered around a folding table, a crude map spread out before them. "What about the cafe?" another voice asked. David recognized it immediately. "Mike, that woman keeps giving us trouble. Maybe we should deal with her first." David's grip on the windowsill tightened, but he forced himself to remain still, listening. "No," Mike continued, jabbing a finger at the map. "We start with the houses on the edge of town. Hit them where it hurts. Jack says we need to make it clear this is our territory now. They don't leave. They burn." David felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. The gang wasn't just content with intimidation. They were escalating to destruction, targeting families and livelihoods. "Paul's out getting the supplies," another man said. "We'll hit the first house just after midnight. Jack said to leave a mark, so they know who's behind it." David's mind raced. They weren't just thugs. They were organized, their violence deliberate and calculated, and Jack's name hung over every word like a shadow, his influence shaping their every move. One of the men leaned back in his chair, his laughter harsh and grating. "And what about the old man from the cafe? Mike said he put up a fight." Mike scoffed. "That fossil? He's nothing. Let him try to stop us again. Jack's got plans for him anyway. Says he wants to handle it personally." David's stomach twisted. Jack wasn't just leading them. He was orchestrating every move. And now, David was firmly in his sights. He ducked lower as one of the men stood, stretching and heading toward the door. "Gotta take a leak," the man muttered, stepping outside. David pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath as the man passed within feet of him, oblivious to his presence. When the door slammed shut, David moved quickly, scanning the table again. His eyes locked on the map, where red circles marked several locations around the town. The cafe was one of them. He needed more information. Moving toward the rear of the warehouse, he found a narrow side door. It was locked, but a firm twist and a shove with his shoulder dislodged the rusted latch. He slipped inside, careful to keep to the shadows. The interior of the warehouse was a chaotic mess of stacked crates, tools, and discarded beer cans. In the center of the room, the table stood under a dim bulb. David moved closer, his eyes darting between the map and the scattered papers. Names and addresses were scribbled hastily in the margins, targets for the gang's planned attacks. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the map, committing the locations to memory. These weren't random acts of violence. Jack was targeting specific people, likely those who opposed him or represented the diversity he sought to erase from the town. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. David slipped behind a stack of crates, his muscles coiled and ready. The man who had gone outside returned, scratching his head as he rejoined the others at the table. "Paul back yet?" the man asked. Mike shook his head. "Not yet, but he'd better hurry. Jack's expecting us to be ready when he gets here." David's heart quickened. Jack was coming tonight. This was his chance to learn more, to confront him, even. But first, he needed to get out undetected. As the men resumed their conversation, David eased his way back toward the side door. His movements were practiced and silent, but the tension was palpable. One wrong step, one accidental sound, and he'd have 3 men to deal with before Jack even arrived. He slipped outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the warehouse. Moving quickly, he returned to the shadows near the vehicles, his mind already planning his next move. The gang wasn't just posturing. They were preparing to escalate, their hatred ready to ignite into violence. And Jack was at the center of it all, pulling the strings with ruthless precision. David clenched his fists as he headed back toward town. He'd seen enough to know the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But if Jack thought he could use their shared past to spread terror, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The sun dipped low in the sky as David approached the edge of town, his boots crunching softly on the gravel road. The faint scent of rust and oil lingered in the air near the abandoned train tracks, where the warehouse loomed like a forgotten giant. Its corrugated metal walls were streaked with grime, and shattered windows dotted its frame, offering glimpses of the shadowed interior. David stopped a few yards away, crouching behind a pile of discarded crates. 2 vehicles sat parked near the warehouse, a battered pickup truck and a sedan with peeling paint. Voices drifted from inside, muffled but agitated. Keeping to the shadows, David edged closer, his steps silent. As he approached an open window, the voices became clearer, their tone tinged with malice. "Tonight's the night," one of the men said, his words clipped and eager. "Jack wants us to hit 'em hard. Show everyone we're serious." David's jaw tightened. He pressed his back against the wall, craning his neck to get a better view through the gap. Inside, 3 men stood around a folding table, a crumpled map spread out before them. "What about that cafe?" another voice asked. David recognized it instantly. "Mike, that woman's been a pain. Maybe we start there." David's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain still. "No," Mike continued, jabbing a finger at the map. "We go for the houses first. Edge of town. Jack says we need to hit them where it hurts. Make 'em scared to stay. If they don't leave, they burn." David's breath caught, his stomach twisting with anger. These weren't random thugs. Their plans were calculated, designed to terrorize and destroy. "Paul's getting the supplies," another man said. "Should be back soon. Once we've got the gear, we start at midnight." "Jack's orders." One of the men leaned back, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "And the old guy from the cafe? Think Jack's still gonna deal with him?" Mike scoffed. "That fossil? He's nothing. Jack says he's got a special plan for him. Wants to make an example of him, just like the rest." David's pulse quickened. Jack wasn't just orchestrating this violence. He was making it personal. He ducked lower as one of the men stood, stretching and heading toward the door. "Gotta take a leak," the man muttered, stepping outside. David pressed himself flat against the wall, holding his breath as the man passed within feet of him. When the door slammed shut, David moved quickly, scanning the table again. His eyes locked on the map, where red circles marked locations around the town. The cafe was one of them. He crept toward the rear of the warehouse, finding a rusted side door. A firm twist and shove dislodged the latch, and David slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat, the dim bulb above the table casting long shadows across the cluttered interior. Moving closer to the table, David scanned the map and the papers scattered around it. Names and addresses were scribbled in the margins, targets for the gang's attacks. His eyes narrowed as he committed the information to memory. These weren't random acts of violence. The gang was targeting families, business owners, and anyone they deemed unwelcome, systematically erasing those who didn't fit their twisted vision of the town. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. David ducked behind a stack of crates, his body tense. The man who'd gone outside returned, scratching his head as he rejoined the others. "Paul back yet?" he asked. Mike shook his head. "Not yet, but he'd better get here soon. Jack's expecting everything to be ready when he arrives." David's heart quickened. Jack was coming tonight. If he stayed, he might confront him face to face. But the gang's plans weren't just a threat. They were evidence. Evidence the authorities needed to stop this before it escalated. He slipped back toward the side door, his movements swift and silent. Each step felt heavier with the knowledge of what he'd learned. Arson, intimidation, and terror, all in the name of hate. Jack's hand was on all of it, his influence driving the gang's violent agenda. Outside, the cool air hit David's face like a wake-up call. The street lamp flickered above, casting long shadows as he hurried toward the road. He needed to get to the police station, and fast. The map, the addresses, the timeline. Every detail he'd gathered could be the key to stopping Jack's plans before they spiraled further out of control. As he approached the outskirts of town, Grace's words echoed in his mind. "You're one man. What if they come after you?" She was right. This wasn't something he could handle alone. Not this time. David clenched his fists as he quickened his pace. The gang thought they were untouchable, that their hate could fester without consequence. But tonight, they'd learn the price of underestimating him. And Jack? Jack would face justice, not just for his crimes, but for the betrayal of everything they once stood for. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above David as he stepped into the police station. The sterile smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of stale coffee. A young officer sitting behind the front desk glanced up, his expression wary as David approached. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone flat. David placed his hands on the counter, his voice steady but urgent. "I need to report a planned attack. A gang is targeting homes and businesses around town, starting tonight." The officer raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "A gang? Which one?" "You've seen them around," David replied, his jaw tightening. "They hang out at the cafe and the warehouse by the old train tracks. Their leader's name is Jack Evans." The officer's expression shifted slightly, but he didn't seem alarmed. "Do you have proof of this planned attack?" David's patience thinned, but he kept his tone measured. "I was at their warehouse. I saw the map they're using to mark targets. They're planning to start burning homes at midnight. Families are in danger." The officer frowned, typing something into his computer. "You were trespassing on their property." David leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Are you seriously more concerned about trespassing than stopping them from burning this town to the ground?" The sharpness of his tone caught the attention of another officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair, who approached the desk. "What's going on here?" David turned to face him. "Your department has a gang problem. I just came from their hideout. They're planning an attack tonight, and they're starting with homes on the edge of town." The older officer studied David, his expression unreadable. "Who are you?" "David Carter, retired military." He rolled up his sleeve, exposing the tattoo. "Jack Evans was in my unit. He's the one leading this." Recognition flickered in the officer's eyes, but it was quickly masked. He glanced at the younger officer, who seemed more confused than concerned. "Let's step into my office," the older officer said, gesturing toward the back. David followed, the door clicking shut behind them. The office was cramped, cluttered with paperwork and faded photos of community events. The officer sat down, gesturing for David to do the same. "Look," the officer began, his tone softer. "I've heard of Jack Evans. His name's come up before, but nothing's ever stuck. If what you're saying is true, we'll handle it. But we need more than just your word." David's frustration boiled beneath the surface. "You don't need more than my word. I saw the map. I heard them planning. They've got addresses, people they're targeting. What more do you need?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the movies, Carter. We can't just storm into their warehouse without evidence. You said there's a map. Where is it?" David hesitated. "It's in the warehouse." "Then we're at a dead end," the officer said. "I can send a patrol car to check the area, but without concrete proof, there's not much we can do." David's hands curled into fists. "If you wait for concrete proof, people are going to get hurt. Or worse. These men aren't bluffing." The officer held up a hand. "I hear you, and I'll do what I can, but you need to trust the system." David stared at him for a long moment, his gut twisting. "The system," he repeated quietly, his voice laced with disbelief. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I hope for everyone's sake. You're right." The officer stood as well, offering a hand. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll look into it." David shook his hand reluctantly, his expression grim. "I hope looking into it is enough." As he left the office and stepped back into the fluorescent-lit lobby, the younger officer avoided his gaze, tapping absently at his keyboard. David pushed open the station doors, the cool night air brushing against his face. For a moment, he stood on the steps, staring out at the quiet town. Lights flickered in distant windows, the streets empty save for the occasional car rolling past. It felt too calm, too normal, given the storm he knew was brewing. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself he'd done all he could. The police had the information. They'd act on it. They had to. As he started walking back toward the cafe, a shadow of doubt crept into his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of the gang's voices, their cruel laughter, and the chilling certainty in their words. Jack Evans wasn't the type to back down. Reaching the edge of town, David glanced toward the darkened skyline. He clenched his fists, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. David paused at the street corner, staring toward the cafe. Its dimly glowing sign flickered like a heartbeat, casting weak light over the sidewalk. Doubts crowded his mind, the police officer's words echoing in his head. "We'll handle it." Will they? He wondered, his gut twisting with doubt. He'd been told the same in the past, always followed by inaction until it was too late. He clenched his fists. He couldn't let Grace's cafe, her livelihood, become another statistic in a report that would be filed too late. With a deep breath, David started forward. His steps quickened as the nagging sense of urgency grew. As he rounded the last corner, his instincts screamed at him. He stopped abruptly, ducking into the shadows of an alley. 3 figures loomed near the cafe's entrance, their movements hurried and deliberate. One of the men shook a gasoline canister, its sloshing contents gleaming faintly in the flickering light. Another crouched by the steps, flicking a lighter absently, the flame dancing in the darkness. "Hurry it up!" the crouched man hissed, glancing over his shoulder. "Mike said we don't have all night. Relax," the man with the canister muttered, pouring gasoline onto the doorframe. "This dump will go up in seconds. She's going to regret ever messing with us." The third man, a wiry figure with a patchy beard, chuckled darkly. "Bet she'll come running out screaming. Maybe we'll have some fun before we torch the rest of it." David's stomach twisted with anger. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Step away from the cafe." All 3 men froze, their heads snapping toward him. For a moment, the only sound was the faint trickle of gasoline pooling on the ground. The wiry man stood slowly, his grin twisting into a sneer. "Well, well, look who decided to show up. Grandpa thinks he can save the day." The man with the canister straightened, his broad shoulders blocking the light. "What are you going to do, old man? Bore us to death with war stories?" He lifted the canister and shook it mockingly. "Maybe we'll give you a head start before we light this place up." David's voice was low and firm, but each word carried weight. "You have one chance to walk away." The crouched man stood, flipping the lighter closed with a snap. "Or what? You going to call the cops? Go ahead. By the time they get here, this place'll be ashes." The wiry man stepped forward, his hands balled into fists. "Think you're tough? Big bad soldier coming to save the town. Newsflash. Gramps, you're not scaring anybody." David stood his ground, his voice like steel. "Last warning. Leave." The wiry man let out a sharp laugh, then lunged. David sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The wiry man howled in pain as David shoved him hard into the cafe wall. "Get him!" the man with the canister shouted, rushing forward. He swung the heavy container like a weapon, aiming for David's head. David ducked, the canister narrowly missing as it slammed into the wall with a dull thud. David countered with a sharp punch to the man's ribs, forcing him to stagger back. The crouched man joined the fray, pulling a crowbar from his jacket. He swung wildly, the metal whistling through the air. David blocked the strike with his forearm, wincing at the impact, but staying focused. With a quick step, he grabbed the crowbar and yanked it free, tossing it aside. The wiry man recovered, charging at David with a shout. David sidestepped again, driving his elbow into the man's side before sweeping his legs out from under him. The man hit the ground hard, gasping for air. The man with the canister roared, charging again with a wild swing. This time, David caught the container mid-swing, twisting it free and slamming it against the man's chest. The canister tumbled to the ground, spilling its contents in a pungent puddle. The crouched man hesitated, his eyes flicking between David and his injured companions. "What the hell is this guy?" he muttered, his confidence faltering. David's eyes narrowed as he advanced. "You're not as tough as you think." The wiry man scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his nose. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife. "I'll show you tough," he snarled, slashing toward David. David stepped back, his movements calm and calculated. The knife sliced through the air, but met only empty space. David grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as the wiry man screamed in pain. "Enough!" the man with the canister shouted, clutching his chest. "We're done!" David released the wiry man, who stumbled backward, clutching his wrist. The three men exchanged panicked glances before the tallest of them growled, "This isn't over. Jack's gonna make sure you pay." David's expression didn't waver. "Tell Jack I'm waiting." The three men staggered away, disappearing into the shadows. David stood still, his chest heaving as he scanned the area. The gasoline canister lay abandoned near the cafe door, its contents soaking into the ground. The cafe door creaked open behind him, and Grace stepped outside, her face pale and drawn. "David, what's going on? Are you hurt?" David turned to her, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They were going to burn it down. They weren't bluffing." Grace's hands trembled as she looked at the canister. "Didn't you call the police? What are they doing?" David shook his head, his jaw clenched. "They said they'd look into it. This is their version of action." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, fear flashing across her face. "What now?" David's gaze shifted toward the horizon, where the faint glow of the warehouse district loomed in the distance. His voice was cold and resolute. "We don't wait. We stop this ourselves." David sprinted through the quiet streets, his breath coming in sharp bursts. His boots struck the pavement in a steady rhythm, but his thoughts were anything but. The cold night air burned in his lungs, but it was nothing compared to the fire of regret gnawing at his chest. "I should have done more." The image of the warehouse map flashed in his mind, the red circles marking homes, businesses, and lives about to be shattered. He'd memorized those locations, convinced it was enough to pass the information to the police. Convinced they would act. But now, with the gasoline still soaking the cafe's doorstep and the gang's threats echoing in his ears, he knew better. "I should have stopped them when I had the chance," he muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. He could still hear their laughter, the casual way they'd planned destruction like it was nothing. "I should have stopped them right then and there." The faint sound of shouting broke through his thoughts, yanking him back to the present. He turned a corner, his eyes scanning the street ahead. A group of neighbors had gathered outside a small house, their voices frantic as smoke billowed from the front porch. Flames licked at the edges of the wooden frame, casting an orange glow against the night. David pushed forward, skidding to a stop in front of the house. A man in his 40s stood at the edge of the porch, trying to douse the flames with a garden hose. The water hissed and steamed as it hit the fire, barely keeping it at bay. "What happened?" David demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The man glanced at him, his face pale and streaked with soot. 3 men. They came out of nowhere, tossed something onto the porch and ran. I barely got my family out in time. David's fists clenched as the man's words confirmed his fears. The gang was already moving, their plans set in motion. He grabbed the hose, stepping closer to the flames and aiming the spray at the base of the fire. The flames sputtered, reluctant to die, but David didn't stop until the last ember faded into smoke. "You need to call the fire department," he said, handing the hose back, "and the police. Tell them everything you saw." The man nodded shakily. "What about them? The ones who did this?" David turned, his expression grim. "I'll deal with them." He didn't wait for a response. already moving toward the next target etched in his memory. His legs burned as he pushed himself harder, his heart pounding with urgency. Every second felt like an eternity. How many more are there? How much damage have they already done? As he approached the edge of town, another plume of smoke rose into the sky. This one blacker and denser than before. The sight made his stomach twist. He veered toward it, cutting through an alley to save time. When he emerged onto the street, he saw them. 2 gang members standing near the back of a hardware store, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of flames dancing in a trash can. One of them held a makeshift torch, the firelight casting jagged shadows across his sneering face. "Hurry up," the taller one said, his voice sharp. "Mike said to hit as many places as we can before Jack shows up." The other laughed, spinning the torch in his hand. "This place? Easy pickings. Nobody here to stop us." David stepped forward, his voice echoing in the stillness. "You're wrong about that." The 2 men spun around, their eyes narrowing as they took him in. For a moment, there was silence, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. "Well, look who it is," the taller man said, his sneer returning. "Thought we taught you your lesson back at the cafe." "You didn't teach me anything," David said evenly, his stance firm. The man with the torch chuckled, tossing it casually from hand to hand. "Big talk for someone who's outnumbered." "You really think you can stop us?" David's eyes flicked to the trash can, where embers were beginning to drift upward, threatening to spread. He shifted his weight, his voice cold. "I've stopped worse than you." The taller man growled, lunging forward. David sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply. The man cried out as the torch clattered to the ground, its flames sputtering out. David followed with a swift strike to the man's stomach, doubling him over. The second man hesitated, his bravado faltering. "You're gonna regret this, old man," he muttered, pulling a crowbar from his belt. David didn't wait. He closed the distance in 2 quick strides, his movements precise. The man swung the crowbar wildly, but David ducked, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him crashing into the wall. The crowbar hit the ground with a metallic clang, and the man scrambled to his feet, clutching his ribs. "You're done," David said, his voice like ice. The men exchanged a panicked glance before turning and fleeing into the shadows. David watched them go, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The embers in the trash can had begun to die. The threat contained, for now. He glanced back at the hardware store, his stomach twisting. He'd stopped this one, but how many more fires had already been set? How many more homes and businesses would fall before the night was over? "This is on me," he thought bitterly. "I should have acted sooner." Clenching his fists, he turned toward the horizon, the faint glow of the warehouse district still visible in the distance. The regret burned hotter than the fires he'd extinguished, but he wouldn't let it stop him. He still had work to do. David's lungs burned as he pushed himself down the empty streets, his senses sharp despite the exhaustion creeping in. The faint wail of a siren cut through the night, making him pause. He turned toward the sound, spotting flashing blue and red lights bouncing off nearby buildings. He ran toward the source, his boots pounding against the pavement. As he turned the corner, he came upon a scene of chaos. 2 police cruisers were parked haphazardly in the street, their lights flashing wildly. An officer stood near a patrol car, shouting into his radio, while another was engaged in a scuffle with 2 gang members near a storefront. One of the gang members swung a bat at the officer, who dodged and tackled him to the ground. The second gang member turned to run, but stopped short when he saw David approaching. "What the hell?" the man spat, raising a wrench in his hand. David didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in 3 quick strides, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The wrench clattered to the ground as the man yelped in pain. David shoved him against the side of the cruiser, pinning him with one arm. The officer nearest him glanced up, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Carter?" he asked, his voice tinged with surprise. David nodded curtly. "Looks like you're finally out here doing something." The officer snorted, slapping cuffs onto the man he'd tackled. "Better late than never. We got a call about fires breaking out and a gang moving through town." He jerked his head toward the other gang member. These two were trying to torch the bakery. David released the man he was holding, allowing the officer to cuff him. The fires aren't random. Jack Evans is behind this. He's got them working in teams, hitting specific targets. The officer's expression darkened. Jack Evans? You serious? Dead serious, David replied. I saw the map at their warehouse. They've planned every attack. If we don't stop them now, they'll burn half the town before sunrise. Another officer jogged over, wiping sweat from his brow. We've got reports of more fires on the north side. It's spreading faster than we can keep up. David's jaw tightened. You need someone who knows their tactics. Let me help. The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. You sure about this? He's right, the first officer said. If he knows their plans, we'd be stupid not to use him. The second officer nodded reluctantly. Fine, but you stay with us. No going rogue. David smirked grimly. No promises. The three piled into one of the cruisers, the engine roaring to life as they sped toward the next location. David sat in the back, his mind racing. He rattled off the addresses he'd memorized from the map, directing the officers to the most likely targets. They're working in teams, he explained, 2 or 3 at a time, hitting places they think are easy targets. They're counting on you being too slow to keep up. The officer driving clenched the wheel tighter. Not tonight. They're not. The cruiser skidded to a stop in front of a small auto repair shop, where 2 gang members were smashing windows and tossing bottles filled with gasoline through the openings. Flames were already licking at the edges of the building as David and the officers jumped out. Freeze! One of the officers shouted, drawing his weapon. The gang members turned, their faces twisting in panic. One of them threw the empty gasoline bottle at the officer, who ducked as it shattered against the patrol car. The other bolted toward the alley, but David was faster. He sprinted after the fleeing man, his boots pounding against the pavement. The man glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay away, old man!" he shouted, pulling a knife from his belt. David didn't slow. When the man lunged, David sidestepped, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The knife fell with a clang, and David shoved the man into the alley wall, pinning him there. "You're done," David growled, his voice cold. The officer caught up moments later, slapping cuffs onto the man as David stepped back, his chest heaving. The second gang member had been subdued near the patrol car, and the officers quickly moved to extinguish the flames spreading through the repair shop. David stood back, his fists clenched as he surveyed the scene. One of the officers approached him, his face grim. "That's 2 teams down, but we're still getting reports of fires on the south side. You think Jack's there?" David's eyes narrowed. "If he's not, he will be soon. He'll want to see the damage for himself. We need to move now." The officer nodded. "Then let's go." As they climbed back into the cruiser, David's resolve hardened. He'd let Jack and his gang go unchecked for too long. Tonight, that ended. The cruiser screeched to a halt outside the warehouse, its flashing lights illuminating the crumbling structure. David stepped out, his eyes scanning the darkened exterior. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows glowing faintly from the dim bulbs inside. "He's here," David said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This is where they regroup. It's their base." The officer closest to him frowned. "Makes sense. They'd fall back here after the attacks. We've got reports of a few fires already stopped, but there's still teams unaccounted for." David nodded grimly. "Jack's orchestrating everything from here. He's not out there setting fires, he's pulling the strings." As they approached the open loading dock, the faint hum of voices reached them. David motioned for the officers to stay low, and they crept toward the entrance. Inside, a group of gang members gathered around Jack, who leaned casually against a stack of crates. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes flicked toward every movement in the room, sharp and calculating. "Mike's team screwed up," one of the gang members muttered, pacing back and forth. "They barely got out of there." "Doesn't matter," Jack replied, his tone calm but commanding. "We've done enough to scare this town. By morning, they'll know who's in charge." "What about Carter?" another asked, glancing nervously toward the warehouse entrance. "He's out there, isn't he? He's not going to stop." Jack smirked. Carter's a relic. He doesn't understand what we're building here. Let him chase shadows while we finish the job." David stepped into the open, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You think I don't understand, Jack?" The gang froze, their heads snapping toward him. Jack turned slowly, his smile fading into a faint look of surprise. "David," he said, his tone almost amused, "I was wondering when you'd show up." David's eyes narrowed as he took another step forward. "It's over. Call your men off." Jack shook his head, his smirk returning. "You always were predictable. Still playing the hero? Thinking you can save everyone? But this isn't the battlefield, David. This is my world now. This," David gestured to the gang members, to the chaos around them, "this isn't strength. This is cowardice. Hiding behind a gang of fools to do your dirty work." Jack's expression darkened. "Careful, David. You're outnumbered, and your badge-wearing friends won't save you." One of the officers stepped into the warehouse, his weapon drawn. "Police! Everyone down, now!" Jack's men erupted into motion, grabbing weapons and scattering. Two lunged toward David, forcing him to duck as a crowbar swung past his head. He countered with a sharp elbow to the nearest attacker's ribs, sending him sprawling. "Keep them busy," Jack barked, backing toward the far end of the warehouse. "I've got other things to handle." David's head snapped toward him. "You're not going anywhere, Jack." But Jack was already slipping into the shadows, his movements swift and deliberate. David turned his attention back to the gang, who were engaging the officers in a chaotic brawl. One officer wrestled a bat away from a gang member, while another exchanged blows with a wiry man wielding a wrench. David moved quickly, grabbing a metal pipe from the ground and blocking a swing aimed at his head. "You think you're gonna stop us, old man?" snarled one of the gang members, lunging at David with a knife. David sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and David shoved the attacker into a stack of crates. "You're nothing but pawns in Jack's game," he said coldly, turning toward the next threat. The officers fought alongside him, their voices commanding as they shouted for the gang to surrender. But the fight was fierce, and the gang was desperate. A second man charged at David, swinging wildly with a chain. David ducked, driving his fist into the man's stomach before sweeping his legs out from under him. "Where's Jack?" one of the officers shouted, scanning the warehouse as the gang began to falter. David's eyes darted toward the back of the room, where an open door swung slowly on its hinges. His stomach twisted with realization. "He's gone," David muttered, his voice laced with frustration. The officer cursed, pinning one of the remaining gang members to the ground. "We'll catch him. Let's clean this up first." David straightened, his chest heaving as he scanned the room. The gang members who hadn't fled were subdued, cuffed, and disarmed. But the sense of victory felt hollow. Jack had used the fight as a distraction, slipping away while his men fought and fell. One of the officers